They ridiculed Earth's Deathworld girl. She floored their champion in one round. Red emergency, lights hit the smoke before Jara Sol could count the entry points. 3 breach vectors, hangar deck, eastern transit corridor, and the ventilation junction above Bay 4. She mapped them without looking up, the way a person maps stairs in the dark, by feel, by habit, by the bone-deep certainty that missing one costs everything. The other trialists were running. She wasn't. Warlord Malakar came through the smoke first, and he was enormous. 8.5 feet of reinforced thermal armor, the industrial lance held low at his side, like a man walking towards something he planned to eat slowly. The deck shook with each step. Around her, Jara heard the sharp crack of someone's equipment case hitting the floor, abandoned mid-stride. She set down her rifle. She picked up the collapsible security baton from the rack on her left, a standard-issue tool, the sort of thing a facility attendant might carry to move stubborn cargo, and she clicked it open to its full 18-inch length. Then she stepped forward. Stay close. What she does next is something the galaxy has no word for yet. 6 days earlier, the staging deck of the Aegis Prime Tactical Foundry smelled like iron-filtered recycled air and the faint, mineral bite of something that had been sealed and resealed too many times. The overhead lights ran cold, a blue-white so sharp it made everything look like evidence. Jara stepped off the transit umbilical and adjusted the collar of her uniform. It didn't fit. The grey standard-issue jacket had been cut for a Malthorian cadet, broader across the chest, longer in the arm, and she had rolled the sleeves twice already. A small thing. It was the sort of thing you either fixed or didn't notice, and she had decided not to notice it. The staging platform held 243 trialists from 31 systems. She had counted them once, quietly, while the transit lock cycled. Most were tall. Several were enormous. A few moved with the particular, unhurried confidence of creatures who had never been told the word no by anything with less than 6 limbs. No one from Earth had completed the Aegis Foundation trial before. The file on her transfer badge said Terran Federation Integration Cohort 1. The word 1 was not ceremonial. It meant she was first. She spun the weighted brass ring across her knuckles, its dull surface swallowing the harsh light without giving any back. The ring was heavy. She had salvaged it from an atmospheric pressure compressor in the industrial sector back home, a place where the air itself pushed back, where you built strength not by lifting things, but by surviving the constant cost of existing. She carried it as a habit, a rhythm. The soft click of metal against her palm grounded her the way a compass grounds a navigator, not by pointing somewhere, but by simply being present. Across the staging platform, a trialist turned to look at her. He was 8 feet tall and built like a geological feature. His name, she would learn later, was Kael'Zor of the Gorgonax hegemony, and his chest plates carried combat achievements etched directly into the obsidian surface, not painted on, not printed, but physically carved, so that his record was part of his body. He looked at Jara the way a person looks at something that wandered in from the wrong room. Sol 3, he said, reading her badge from a distance that should have made reading impossible. His voice carried the particular resonance of a species that communicated partly through chest vibration. The Council files list your world as a non-combat biosphere, coastal savannas, moderate weather, calcium-based skeleton. He said calcium-based skeleton, the way one might say made of dry leaves. Jara blinked once. The slow blink her family called her clock face, the steady, unmoved rhythm that matched the deep space navigation pulses she had grown up hearing through the walls of the platform habitats. She said nothing. Kael'Zor made a sound that his people used instead of laughter, a percussive click from behind the jaw, and turned back to his cohort. At the front of the staging platform, Director Vale tapped his assessment slate. He was Vreniti, 6-limbed, hyperflexible, with the careful, meritocratic energy of a creature that believed tests were moral events. He called the roll without looking up. Trial Block 9, hand-to-hand sorting, he said, all cohorts to the main floor. The training arena, had a ceiling high enough to accommodate a Malthorian standing fully upright on another Malthorian's shoulders, which was apparently something that had happened here before, judging by the scorch mark 20 feet up the east wall. Low-gravity stabilizing rings hummed at each corner, keeping the environment at a consistent pull, one designed to favor the larger species, Jara noted, who needed the artificial assist more than she did. She walked to the central training terminal and registered her physical parameters without hurrying. Height 57, mass 143 pounds, augmentation status none beyond standard neural sync nodes, combat designation security specialist, industrial zone. The terminal read her file and paused. A pause she noticed. The terminal did not pause for the Gorgonak's entries. It did not pause for the Malthorian with the muscle grafts, a trialist named Tauron who had been flexing at his own reflection in the equipment bay for 20 minutes. It processed them the same way a scale processes a known weight. Her file made it think. She did not touch the terminal again. She stepped back, rolled the brass ring across her fingers twice, and waited. 3 rows back, Tauron made a remark she was meant to hear. Something about the structural integrity of calcium. Something about how the first real bout would solve the question of whether Terran candidates generated enough force to trip a motion sensor. He got a good response from the surrounding cohort. Jara watched the ring move across her knuckles. The sorting began with the Vreniti cohort. Prin, sleek, six-limbed, with serrated striking plates along each forearm, stepped into the ring first. She moved with the liquid certainty of someone who had trained in multi-vector attack corridors since early childhood, her body angling and re-angling at speeds that made her look like she was negotiating with gravity rather than obeying it. The first round of eliminations went quickly. Tauron dispatched a Vreniti auxiliary in 2 strikes. A Gorgonak secondary took down a Seth trialist in 1. The scoreboard updated with the clean efficiency of a machine that had done this many times. Then Director Vale called Block 9. Jara stepped forward. Prin met her in the ring. For a moment nothing happened, just 2 figures standing at arm's length, the arena quietly assessing them both. Prin's serrated plates extended. Her 6 limbs shifted into an opening array that Jara recognized as a multi-vector piercing sequence. High strike, mid-feint, low sweep, secondary anchor, strike from the left rear limb. Standard practiced, fast. Prin lunged. Jara moved her left shoulder 3 inches. The high strike passed through where her collarbone had been. She felt the air displacement, sharp, close, the precise thermal trace of a fast-moving mass that almost connected, and she was already somewhere else. Prin corrected, pivoted for the low sweep. Jara dropped her weight, not a crouch, something lower and more complete than that, a compression of her entire center of gravity toward the floor as if the deck itself had called her down. The arena's stabilizing rings registered it and briefly struggled to calibrate. The artificial gravity in her corner flickered by a fraction. The sweep met nothing. Prin reset, surprised. She had expected the standard response from a smaller combatant: retreat, guard, create distance. She had not expected the floor to stay under the human's feet like they had an arrangement. Her primary limbs came back for the secondary sequence. Jara stepped inside them. Close, too close for the serrated plates to angle correctly. Close enough that the only option was grapple, and Prin's body structure, 6 limbs, each designed for reach and multi-vector speed, was not built for grappling at contact range. Jara drove her fist into Prin's primary neural cluster. Not fast, precise. The way you drive a bolt through specific material, no wasted movement, no showmanship. The sound was a dull, deep thud that carried across the arena with an authority that had nothing to do with volume. Prin folded. 3.2 seconds. The medical drones moved before the scoreboard updated. The arena did not make a sound. Director Vale looked down at his slate. His upper limbs, which had been moving steadily since the start of the session, went still. He set the slate down on the rail in front of him and picked it up again. He pressed 2 fingers to the edge of the screen, calling up a file that required a secondary authorization to access. He read what came up on the screen. He read it again. From across the arena, Jara heard Kael'Zor's jaw click stop. She returned to the equipment bench and picked up the brass ring from where she'd set it. Outside, on the secondary observation deck, she caught the edge of Vale's voice through the partition glass, not his words, just the tone. It was the tone of a careful, controlled creature encountering something his controls were not built to handle. She rolled the ring across her knuckles. Click, click, click. The terminal near the bench was still displaying her file. She had not closed it. One line sat at the top of the display, above all her formal records, in the pale amber text of an unverified classification. Origin World, Sol 3. Gravity Profile, unconfirmed, pending restricted access query. She looked at it for a moment. She did not think about what the file would say when Vale unlocked it. She thought about the morning routine at home, the weight of the air in the industrial zones, the way your legs learned to move through it, the way every step became a small negotiation with a planet that was bigger than you and never let you forget it. She thought about 6 millennia of that. She flicked the ring upward, caught it without looking, and waited for morning. Kael'Zor came to the ring in the morning without being called. That was the first sign. The morning session wasn't scheduled for another 40 minutes, and the arena was half empty, just the early risers running solo drills, the tactical coordinators running calibrations on the scoring sensors, and Morven, the cautious Seth coordinator who always arrived first and left last, and never quite looked comfortable in any room he occupied. Kael'Zor walked past all of them and stepped into the primary sparring circle, as if the circle had been waiting for him specifically. He stood in the center and looked across the arena floor at Jara. She was at the equipment bench. She had arrived earlier than he had, which he either hadn't expected or had chosen not to acknowledge. She was going through a slow, careful sequence of shoulder rotations, not a warm-up in any sense the Gorgonak's training doctrine would recognize, more like a systems check, the deliberate confirmation of each joint's range before the day asked anything of it. She saw him. She did not adjust her pace. He waited. She finished the rotation sequence, picked up the brass ring from the bench, and walked toward the circle. No one said anything about the scheduling gap. The trialists who were present drifted toward the viewing rails with the quiet inevitability of a tide, and Morven set down his calibration tool and activated the scoring sensor without being asked. Some things announced themselves. Kael'Zor rolled his shoulders. The combat achievements etched into his chest plates caught the overhead light and threw it back in hard, geometric patterns, constellations of documented victories, each one carved in at the moment of its completion. He had 47 of them. Jara had counted them the day before, the way she counted entry points. He said nothing. He simply raised his right hand to chest height, opened it flat, and closed it into a fist, a Gorgonak's gesture that meant, roughly, I see you as something worth ending. Jara stepped into the circle. He moved fast for his size. That was the thing about the Gorgonaks that the secondary briefing materials had mentioned and then failed to adequately convey. The mass did not slow them. It was stored kinetic potential, not dead weight. When Kael'Zor threw his right hand toward her center of mass, the air in front of it compressed. She felt it before it arrived. Not fast enough to dodge entirely. She understood that immediately and clearly, the way you understand structural information about a room you're standing in: exits, load-bearing walls, points of failure. A full lateral dodge would leave her off balance on a stabilized floor against a Gorgonax who was already correcting. She had about a quarter second. She used it to step inside. Not away from the strike. Into it, closing the distance, so the arm had no room to extend, so the mass had no room to build the final meter of velocity it needed to do what it was designed to do. His fist grazed her shoulder with enough force to push her half a step sideways. She felt it in her teeth. She grabbed his wrist. His momentum was still traveling. She didn't try to stop it. She redirected it, a small shift of her hips, a drop of her center toward the floor, a pivot that borrowed everything his body had committed to that strike and simply pointed it somewhere else. Down. 650 pounds of armored Gorgonax, war champion, went over her shoulder. The floor did not appreciate the landing. The composite panels, rated for heavy equipment transit, for the full impact of Malthorian sparring, for the operational stress of things twice Kael'Zor's size, cracked. A fracture line spread from the point of impact in 3 directions, stopping at the edge of the scoring sensor field. Kael'Zor lay on his back. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Jara stepped forward and placed her boot on his chest, not hard, not with any particular emphasis, just with the calm certainty of something that had made a point and was waiting for it to be understood. He lay still, his quadocular arrays focused upward. He raised one hand, palm flat, and set it against the floor. Unconditional surrender, the same gesture, the other direction. The arena was absolutely quiet. Not the stunned quiet of an unexpected outcome. This was something deeper than that, something that had weight to it, the way a room goes quiet after a sound it doesn't have a category for. Tauron's muscle grafts had stopped twitching. Morven had both hands on the rail and was looking at the fracture line in the floor. 3 Vreniti trialists in the upper viewing bay had oriented all 6 of their limbs toward the circle, which was what Vreniti did when something required their full processing attention. Jara stepped back and let Kael'Zor rise. He rose slowly, not from injury. She had targeted his momentum, not his body, but from the particular difficulty of a creature whose self-concept was reorganizing in real time. He stood to his full height, looked at her for a long moment with all 4 of his eyes, and then walked out of the circle without speaking. He did not look back. Director Vale was already gone from the upper observation rail. Jara had noted the absence before Kael'Zor even hit the floor. She picked up the brass ring from where she'd set it at the circle's edge. Click, click, click. She found out later what Vale had seen on his data tablet. Not from him, he would not speak to her directly for another 2 days, but from Morven, who had been standing close enough to the upper rail to read the screen reflection in the observation glass. The planetary profile for Sol 3 loaded in full when Vale keyed in his secondary authorization. Not the public summary that lived in the Open Council files, the one that listed coastal savannas, moderate weather, calcium-based biology, but the restricted assessment that the Terran Federation had required as a condition of integration, the one that took a senior facility director's clearance to access. Morven said Vale went very still when he read it. The line that did it, according to Morven, wasn't the gravity classification, though that was significant. It was the notation beneath it. A single sentence added by the Xenobiological Assessment Team after their survey of Earth's medical history, its archaeological record, and 6,000 years of documented internal conflict. Native species has demonstrated consistent capability to adapt combat methodology to environmental stress loads, exceeding all current hegemony baseline models. Below that, in the clean amber of a data field that had been filed and forgotten 40 years ago, was a single entry under planetary gravity profile. Grade 12. The Gorgonax homeworld sat at Grade 4. The Foundry's standard gravity for trials was Grade 2. Vreniti auxiliary cadets were given medical waivers if their assignments took them above Grade 5 for more than 3 consecutive solar cycles. Jara had been born at Grade 12. She had grown up at Grade 12. She had walked to her first day of school at Grade 12, carrying a bag that weighed what a Vreniti auxiliary cadet weighed, because her mother had told her it built character and her planet had agreed. Morven told her this 3 days later in the Eastern Transit Corridor, in a low voice, while checking whether anyone was close enough to hear. He accessed the full file, Morven said, the biological threshold data, the internal conflict history. He paused. He sat down, he added, as if this detail completed the picture in a way that nothing else could. She nodded. He sat down after reading about the gravity or after reading about the 6,000 years, she asked. Morvin thought about it. Both times, he said. The 3 days between the Kael'Zor bout and the raid had a particular texture that Jara would remember later for reasons that had nothing to do with what happened during them. The mocking had stopped, not gradually, immediately, and completely the way a sound stops when its source is removed. Tauron had not made a remark about calcium since the morning of the bout. The Vreniti cohort had begun timing their drills to start after hers, which was not a coincidence she examined closely. What she noticed, instead, was the way the other trialists watched her move. Not with the casual evaluation of the first day, the brief, dismissive sizing up that a larger species gives a smaller one. This was different. This was the careful, slightly unnerved observation of creatures who were trying to understand a system they didn't have the right variables for. She would cross the training floor and feel it without looking up. She would reach for a piece of equipment and notice the nearest trialist step back by half a pace without seeming to know they had done it. She did not change her pace. She did not change her routine. She ran her drills. She ran them again. She ate in the main mess with her tray and her brass ring set beside the plate, and she slept 6 hours in the narrow bunk that had also been sized for a Malthorian, and she did not think too much about what the file had said or what Vale was doing with the information. She was thinking, instead, about the gap in the eastern transit corridor where the emergency ventilation shaft met the hangar wall, a structural detail she had noted on her first full walkthrough of the facility 3 hours after arrival, before she had spoken to anyone or registered anything, or let anyone see her do anything except look like someone who was lost and reading the posted transit maps. She wasn't lost, she was mapping. She was always mapping. On the 4th day, Director Vale called a facility-wide formation on the main observation deck and did not explain why. He stood at the front of the assembled trialists with his data tablet held flat against his lower limb, and his upper limbs folded in the Vreniti formal posture that indicated he was about to say something he had prepared carefully and would not be taking questions about. Jara stood at the back of the formation and rolled the brass ring slowly across her knuckles. Trial Block 9 assessments are complete, Vale said. All cohorts have been assigned to sectored training tracks for the next 10-day cycle. Individual track assignments will be distributed through the main terminal. He paused. There will be one additional notation for the Sol 3 candidate. Every set of eyes in the formation moved to her. Her file is being escalated to the Foundry High Command for classification review, he said. This is not disciplinary. This is procedural. Another pause, shorter. The classification review will determine the appropriate track tier for a candidate whose homeworld parameters fall outside current standard assessment models. He closed his tablet. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, not with hostility, not with the dismissive evaluation of the first day, but with the careful, slightly vertiginous focus of someone standing at the edge of something they cannot fully see the bottom of. Then he dismissed the formation. Jara walked back to her bunk, picked up her training kit, and thought about the ventilation shaft in the eastern corridor. She thought about the 3 entry points she had mapped in the first hour. She thought about the distance from the main hangar floor to the secondary equipment racks, and whether a person of her mass could cross it in the time it would take a thermal lance to cycle for a second discharge. She was still thinking about it when the alarms started. They started at 3:40 station time, a sound that cut through the low background hum of the Foundry's environmental systems with the particular authority of a tone that meant not a drill. Red light replaced white throughout the facility in the space of a breath. The intercom carried Director Vale's voice for exactly 4 seconds before the signal cut. All non-combat personnel to designated shelter. Vayish Corsair vessels have breached orbital. Then static. 4 breach points, Jara counted, hearing the sequence of impact through the station hull the way you hear footsteps through a floor, not clearly, but precisely enough. The hangar deck, the eastern transit corridor, the junction above Bay 4, and one more somewhere aft that she hadn't mapped yet, which meant she had between 40 seconds and 2 minutes before the tactical picture became something she was reacting to instead of reading. She was already moving. The fourth breach point was the mess hall. She knew it before she reached the first corridor junction, heard the particular resonance of a hull impact through the station's ventilation network, a lower frequency than the hangar breach, which meant a larger entry point, which meant more personnel or heavier equipment or both. The tactical picture reorganized itself in the 2 seconds it took her to round the corner. Hangar deck, primary insertion. Eastern transit, flanking route. Bay 4 junction, cut off the shelter access. Mess hall, blocked the main corridor artery that connected the training wings to the command tier. Not a raid, a net. She stopped running and started walking. Running was for people who hadn't mapped the space yet. The Eastern Transit corridor was 30 meters ahead. She could hear movement in it, the heavy, rhythmic impact of armored boots on composite flooring heading toward the hangar from the secondary entrance. Malakar's vanguard, cutting through from the mess hall breach to reinforce the primary insertion team. They hadn't come through yet. She had maybe 40 seconds. She turned left into the equipment bay instead. The equipment bay at this hour held nothing useful as a weapon and everything useful as a position. Supply crates stacked 3 high along the south wall, an overhead maintenance track that ran the full length of the ceiling, a secondary access hatch in the northeast corner that opened into the ventilation shaft she had been thinking about for 4 days. She was through the hatch in 8 seconds. The ventilation shaft was not designed for human transit. It was designed for filtered air and the occasional maintenance drone, which meant it was exactly wide enough and exactly low enough to require moving at a specific angle with her shoulders rotated forward and her head down. The composite walls were cold. The air smelled of recycled coolant and the faint mineral trace of the station's deep filtration system, a smell she associated with recycled spaces, with the industrial sectors back home where the air had to work as hard as the people in it. She moved fast. 30 meters, left turn, another 20. The shaft opened above Bay 4's junction, which was below and ahead of her. Through the ventilation grate, she could see the junction floor, 2 of Malakar's armored guards establishing a hold position, their backs to the maintenance track, their thermal rifles aimed at the shelter access corridor. Jara studied their armor. Joint seals at the hip, cooling vents along the upper back, the standard configuration for Vayish Corsair heavy infantry designed for shipboard combat where the corridors were narrow and the threat came from directly ahead, not designed for an angle above and behind. She moved past the grate without stopping. She came out of the shaft above the main hangar deck. The scene below her organized itself in the first second. Malakar at the center, still advancing, the thermal lance held at low carry. 6 guards fanned out to his left and right. At the far end of the hangar, behind an overturned equipment sled, she could see the shapes of 4 trialists who had not made it to the shelters, Morvin among them, recognizable by the careful way he was making himself small. Kael Zor was standing against the far wall. Not hiding, just standing, with his arms at his sides and his quadocular arrays fixed on Malakar, with an expression that Jara had learned to read in the last 4 days as Gorgonak's neutral. Not fear, not readiness. Something between them, a creature watching a situation it hadn't categorized yet. He had not moved toward the shelter. He had not moved toward the raiders either. She filed it and moved on. The maintenance track gave her a clear line to the secondary equipment racks directly above Malakar's left flank. She clicked the security baton once, confirming extension. 18 inches, weighted tip, enough if she placed it correctly. She dropped. The first guard didn't hear her until she was inside his reach, which was the point. She hit the cooling vent at the back of his armor with the baton, not the vent itself, but the thin collar of exposed joint material connecting it to the main plate, and the suit's power regulation dropped on the left side. He staggered. She was already past him, rolling under the arc of his rifle, coming up behind the second guard. Joint lock, left arm. The elbow doesn't bend that direction for Vayish Corsair anatomy, and she knew that from 6 days of watching them move in the pre-raid footage, that every integration candidate was given on their transit umbilical, and that most of them did not watch 3 times. She had watched it 4. The second guard went down. Malakar turned. He was faster than he looked, and he looked fast. The thermal lance came around in a flat arc aimed at her center of mass, a good instinct, technically correct, the right response to a close-range threat at this distance. She dropped below it, felt the heat signature pass over her hair, and drove her palm upward into the underside of his wrist. The lance tilted, not dropped, he had a grip, but tilted enough. She moved to his right side and hit the closest cooling vent with everything she had. He stumbled, 300 pounds of armored warlord, stumbling, just for a moment, just the single step of a creature that didn't expect the floor to suddenly require more from it. She had that moment, and she used it. The baton, reversed, driven through the cooling vent aperture directly into the regulation hardware behind it. The lance powered down. Malakar stood with a dead weapon in his hands and looked at her. She looked back. Around them, the remaining guards had stopped moving. 2 were down. 2 more were backing toward the hangar entrance, weapons raised but not firing, the particular hesitation of soldiers who have watched their commanding officer get disarmed in close quarters by something they don't have a category for. "Tell them to drop," Jara said. Her voice came out even. She was breathing harder than she liked, and her left shoulder ached from the graze of Kael'Zor's strike 4 days ago in a way that the morning drills had been managing and the last 4 minutes had not. But her voice came out even. Malakar looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her baton. Then he looked at the guards. He said something in Vayish that she didn't have the translation for, but the guards understood because the weapons came down. The silence after was the loud kind. Jara became aware of several things at once. Morven's head appearing above the equipment sled, his expression suggesting that his internal threat modeling had not included this outcome. The hum of the station's environmental systems reasserting themselves as the breach alarms cycled down from emergency to containment mode. A thin line of smoke from Malakar's deactivated lance curling toward the ventilation grate she had come through 8 minutes ago. And Kael'Zor, still against the far wall, still watching, but something in his posture had shifted. The Gorgonak's neutral expression had given way to something she didn't have a reference for yet. His arms were no longer at his sides. One hand rested, almost without seeming to, against the combat achievements etched into his chest plate. She did not have time to read what that meant. She crossed to where Morven was crouched and put her hand on the sled. "Anyone hurt?" she asked. "Structurally," he said, in the tone of someone answering a different question than the one they were asked. He meant the hangar, the floor composite, the equipment sled, which had taken a glancing thermal hit. He did not mean himself, though his upper limbs were shaking in a way he was trying to control by pressing them flat against the sled's side. "Good enough," she said. She stepped back toward Malakar. Here is what she did not do. She did not make a speech. She did not tell him what this meant or what it said about Earth or about the galaxy's fundamental misreading of what she was. She had a line in her head, had carried it since before she shipped out, the kind of thing you think of in the industrial zones late at night when the gravity is pressing down and you're thinking about the people who built the systems you work inside, the ones who assumed you had a ceiling, but she did not say it. She zip-tied his wrists with a piece of equipment rigging from the rack behind her. She did it the way she had done everything in the last 8 minutes, without hurry, without drama, with the clean efficiency of a person who measured effort against outcome and did not spend the extra. Then she went to check on the trialists behind the sled. There were 4 of them: Morven, a Vreniti auxiliary whose name she hadn't learned, 2 Seth candidates she recognized from the morning drills. None of them were injured. All of them were looking at her the way Vale had looked at her from the upper rail, with the careful, slightly vertiginous attention of creatures recalibrating at speed. "There's a 4th breach in the mess hall," she told them. Secondary team, probably waiting on Malakar's signal to advance. Morvin, the intercom in the transit corridor still active. Should be, he said. The signal cut was external. The internal network runs separate. Good, she handed him the end of the equipment rigging she'd used on Malakar. Hold this. She found the intercom panel in the eastern corridor 12 seconds later and keyed the internal command channel. This is Sol, Trial Block 9, she said. Hangar deck is clear. Primary insertion team is down. Warlord Malakar is in custody. She paused. The secondary team in the mess hall has 30 seconds to signal surrender before I come find out what their cooling vents look like. Static, then, from somewhere in the mess hall, the flat two-tone that the Vayish Corsair used for unconditional stand-down. She let out a breath through her nose. She had not known for certain that would work. She walked back to the hangar. High Command arrived 32 minutes later, which told her something about the response time from the command tier to the hangar deck, and which she filed under things to raise in the integration debrief. By the time they arrived, the raiders in the mess hall had been moved to the secondary holding bay. Malakar was sitting on the equipment sled with his wrists tied and his thermal lance in pieces on the floor beside him. And Jara was crouched next to a Vreniti auxiliary with a stress fracture in her lower left limb, using a strip of thermal padding from a supply crate to build a brace. The lead high command officer, a Malthorian in dress plating, 3 ranks above Director Vale, stepped into the hangar and stopped. He looked at Malakar. He looked at the 2 deactivated guards. He looked at Jara, who was tying a knot in the thermal padding and asking the Vreniti auxiliary if the pressure was too much. He said something to Vale in the Vreniti administrative dialect that Jara's translation nodes rendered as approximately, "Is that the human?" And Vale, standing slightly behind the Malthorian's left shoulder, said, "Yes." There was a silence. "She used a baton," the Malthorian said. "Yes," Vale said again. The Malthorian looked at the floor, at the fracture line from Kael'Zor's landing 4 days ago, still unrepaired, still spreading in 3 directions from its origin point. "The file," he said, "the restricted planetary assessment, how many people have seen it?" Vale hesitated. And in that hesitation, that single, careful pause from a creature who was very good at not hesitating, Jara heard the thing that no one was going to say out loud in this hangar, not today, and maybe not for a long time. The question wasn't about the file. The question was about what happened next, not to Malakar, not to the Vayish Corsairs, not to the Foundry. What happened next to the rest of the galaxy, now that it knew what Earth actually was. She finished the knot on the Vreniti auxiliary's brace. "Good?" she asked. The Vreniti looked at her. All 6 limbs had oriented toward her again, the full processing posture, not threat assessment, something else. Something Jara didn't quite have the reference for in Vreniti body language, though it resembled the posture her co-workers back home used when they were trying to figure out how to say something they hadn't said before. "Good," the Vreniti said, after a moment. Across the hangar, Director Vale still hadn't answered the Malthorian's question. Vale answered the Malthorian's question the way careful creatures answer questions they know will be repeated in rooms they won't be present for, slowly and with precision. "The file has been seen by myself, 2 xenobiological classification officers, and the assessment team that filed the original survey." He paused. "And the candidate herself is aware of its contents." The Malthorian looked at Jara. She had finished the brace. She was sitting on the edge of the equipment sled now, not because she needed to rest, but because the Vreniti auxiliary needed someone close, and the particular quality of the Malthorian's attention made sitting feel like the right geometry. Lower, less threatening. An old habit from the industrial zones, where the workers twice her size relaxed when she stopped taking up the same vertical space they did. She had learned early that appearing smaller was not the same as being smaller. "Candidate Sol," the Malthorian said. "So, your integration assessment was filed 6 hours ago by Director Vale. He glanced at the tablet in Vale's hands without taking it. Before the breach. I assumed it would be. You assumed correctly. He looked at the deactivated guards on the hangar floor. He looked at Malakar on the sled. He looked at the baton in her hand, still extended, still in her grip, the way a tool stays ready until the job is confirmed finished. The classification review has been withdrawn. She waited. There is no tier in the current assessment model, he said. That accounts for your homeworld parameters. We would be assigning you to a category that was not built for you. I know, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a creature choosing its next words from a set of options it didn't entirely like, the High Command will be convening a curriculum review. It is possible that the assessment model itself requires revision. It was the most he was going to say. She understood that. Yes, sir, she said. He looked at the fracture line in the floor, the one from Kael'Zor's landing, 4 days old, spreading in 3 directions. He said nothing else. He turned and walked toward the exit, his dress plating catching the overhead light as he went, and the 2 officers behind him followed. Vale did not follow immediately. He stood in the space the Malthorian had occupied, holding his data tablet against his lower limb, and looked at the hangar floor, at the fracture line, at the pieces of Malakar's thermal lance arranged on the composite, at Jara sitting on the sled with an 18-inch baton in her hand and a Vreniti Auxiliary's thermal brace in her lap. The survey team that classified your world, he said. They accessed the gravity profile and the surface temperature range and the atmospheric density. He stopped. They did not stay long enough to access the conflict history. I know, she said again. 6 millennia, he said. It was not a question. Give or take. He looked at the fracture line one more time. Then he closed his tablet and left. The hangar took on a different quality after the command personnel cleared out, quieter in the way that rooms go quiet after something large has moved through them, not peaceful, but emptied. The environmental systems hummed. The ventilation ran. The smoke from Malakar's lance had thinned to almost nothing. Jara stood up. She walked to where Malakar sat on the sled, wrists bound, his armor still running on partial power. He was watching her approach with the flat, careful attention of a creature that had revised its threat model and was working through the implications, not afraid, recalibrating. She crouched to his eye level. He was still big, still armored, still, she was certain, dangerous in any number of environments that were not this one. None of that had changed. She was not confused about what he was or what he had come here to do. You're targeting data on this facility, she said. You picked it specifically. He said nothing. Not because of the supply stores, not because of the command infrastructure. She looked at him because of the integration program, the first cohort. Still nothing. You wanted to see us fail, she said, in front of an audience. He met her eyes, and in the long, flat silence that followed, she got her answer not from anything he said, but from the absence of denial, which was its own kind of language. She stood up. Tell whoever sent you, she said, that the first cohort didn't fail. She walked away before he could choose to respond or not respond, because the choice didn't matter either way. She found the brass ring where she had left it, on the console near the secondary equipment rack, where she had set it before climbing into the ventilation shaft. It had rolled slightly toward the edge of the console and had stopped against the lip without falling. She picked it up. It was warm from sitting under the work lights. The dull metal surface had caught a thin coat of the coolant mineral smell that lived in the ventilation system, which mixed with the recycled air scent of the hangar in a way that made her think briefly, clearly, of home. Not the coastal savannas listed in the public council files. The other home, the one with the weight in the air. She set the ring down on the console and did not put it back on her finger. Not yet. Kael'Zor found her 20 minutes later, in the eastern transit corridor, running a slow shoulder rotation sequence against the wall, the same one she had been running the morning he came to the ring without being called. Her left shoulder was stiff in a way she was addressing methodically, joint by joint, the way the industrial zone medics had taught her. Don't push it, just move it. Let the blood reach the decision before you ask the decision to hold anything. He stood at the corridor entrance. She kept rotating. The thermal grays, he said after a moment. His translation nodes were set to standard, which gave his voice a flatter sound than the chest resonance she had heard in the arena. From my strike 4 days ago, it is impeding your range. It'll clear, she said. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. I have been told by 3 different sources in the last hour that you used a baton against Malakar's vanguard. It was available. Another silence, longer. The assessment brief for Sol 3, he said, the public version, I read it the night before I came to the foundry. He paused. I read the wrong version. She stopped the rotation and looked at him. His hand had moved again to his chest plate, to the edge of it, not to the achievements, but to the space beside them, the uncarved space. She hadn't noticed it before. There was a section of the obsidian surface to the left of the main record, deliberately left blank, not unfinished, reserved. She didn't ask, what for? Your systems calculated my mass, she said. They forgot to calculate my world's pull. He looked at her for a long moment with all 4 of his eyes. No, he said, we forgot to ask what your world cost you to survive. He turned and walked back toward the training wing. She watched him go. The corridor was quiet. The overhead lights ran cold and steady. Her left shoulder had loosened by a degree, not fixed, but moving better, the blood reaching the places that needed it. No ceremony, no declaration, no acknowledgement that the galaxy had changed what it thought it knew. Just a corridor and a man walking away, and a shoulder that was going to need another 20 minutes before it held anything heavy. She went back to the hangar and picked up the brass ring. 3 months later, Director Vale submitted a 1-page revision request to the Foundry High Command Curriculum Board. It proposed a new assessment tier, not a revision of the existing system, but an addition above it, a category without a precedent designation, filed under the working title of Environmental Stress Integration, Unmodeled Parameters. The request cited 1 case study. The case study had no statistics. It had a name, a home world, and a single sentence borrowed from the Xenobiological Survey notes. The environmental pressures of Sol 3 have produced adaptations that fall outside the range of any existing model. The board approved it in 4 days. The approval was fast for a high command curriculum review, people noticed. A few of the faster-moving intelligence services in the outer systems began pulling the restricted planetary profile that Vale had accessed in the upper observation bay, and then pulling the public file to compare the two, and then sitting with the gap between them in a way that produced a specific kind of silence. The silence of an organization discovering that it has been underestimating something for a long time without knowing it. Within 6 weeks, the Terran Federation received 17 formal requests from outer system governments, defense advisory partnerships, integration frameworks, emergency consultation contracts. All 17 arrived within the same 48-hour window. Jara was in the mess hall when Morven told her. He sat across from her with his data tablet and read her the list, quietly, in the careful voice he used when information required framing before it landed. She ate while he read. When he finished, she set her fork down and looked at the table. 17, he said, in 48 hours. She nodded. There will be more, she said. Morven looked at his tablet. How many more? She thought about the industrial zones, about the morning routine, about the weight of the air on the first day of every year when you were small enough that it still surprised you, about 6 millennia of what happened when a species couldn't outrun the thing that was trying to kill it and had to learn, instead, to turn around and face it. All of them, she said, eventually. Morven set the tablet face down on the table. The mess hall was quiet around them. The environmental system hummed. The lights ran cold and steady the way lights in recycled air stations always run, not warm, not inviting, just present, doing their job. Jara picked up her fork. She finished eating. She was on the observation deck alone that evening, watching the slow rotation of the asteroid field that the foundry was anchored to, when she took the brass ring from her pocket and set it on the console railing. It was the same railing where she had first seen Vale standing, in the early hours after the Kael'Zor bout, reading a file that reorganized what he thought he knew. The same railing where the Malthorian officer had stood 3 hours ago, looking at the fracture line in the floor below. 17 requests, 48 hours, more coming. The ring sat on the railing without moving, its dull surface absorbing the faint light of the asteroid field the way it absorbed everything, taking it in, giving nothing back, heavier than it looked. Out past the asteroid field, somewhere in the dark between star systems, other intelligence services were pulling files, comparing numbers, sitting with the gap. The ring clicked once against the railing as the station's rotation made a small correction. Cold, steady, waiting.